I watched my sister's fingers wrap around the oxygen tube, and I couldn't scream. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't do anything but lie there trapped inside my own body while Melissa leaned close and whispered, "You know what your problem is, Danielle. You've never learned to be grateful." Then she pulled. The air vanished. My lungs burned. The heart monitor shrieked, and through the haze of terror, I saw her smile. Not angry, not rushed, just satisfied, like she was teaching a child a lesson. 30 seconds later, she plugged it back in, patted my hand, and walked out humming. When I finally recovered enough to tell my parents what happened, my mother sighed and said, "Melissa was just worried about you. Stop being so dramatic." They believed her. They always believed her, but they didn't know about the nurse who had been watching, the one who started asking questions, the one who would eventually stand in a courtroom and say 6 words that made my mother's face turn white. Have you ever been trapped voiceless, while the people who should protect you looked the other way? My name is Danielle Carter. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent the last decade building a career as a financial manager at a private investment firm. I'm good at my job. I own my own apartment. I pay my own bills. And until 3 weeks ago, I thought my biggest problem was that my family never seemed to notice any of it. I should have known that being invisible was the point. Growing up in the Carter household meant understanding one fundamental truth: Melissa came first. Always. My younger sister was born with a congenital heart defect that nearly killed her at age 5. She survived, and from that moment on, my parents treated her like a miracle wrapped in glass. Everything she wanted, she received. Every mistake she made was excused. Every achievement was celebrated as if she had conquered Everest. And me, I was the caretaker, the one who was told over and over, "Your sister almost died, Danielle. You must always put her first." I learned to shrink, to accommodate, to disappear into the background of my own life while Melissa occupied center stage. I used to think my mother simply loved Melissa more. Now I understand it was something darker. She needed one daughter to shine and one daughter to serve. She designed us that way. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Melissa's perfect life was falling apart. 2 years ago, she borrowed $80,000 for a man who promised to leave his wife for her. He took the money and vanished. Melissa couldn't tell our parents the truth. It would shatter the image she had spent her whole life maintaining. So instead, she started asking questions, quiet questions, about inheritance, about grandmother's house, which had been left equally to both of us, about what would happen if something happened to me. Our mother's response, I would later learn, was simple. "Don't worry, sweetheart. When the time is right, we'll make sure you're taken care of." I wonder sometimes if I sensed something was wrong. I had been having dreams, the same dream, over and over about falling down the stairs when I was 17. I remembered the hospital stay, the 3 weeks of recovery, the way everyone said it was just an accident. But in my dreams, I felt hands on my back, a push, a whisper of movement before the fall. I mentioned it to my mother once. Her reaction was immediate and sharp. "Stop making things up, Danielle. You were always so dramatic." So I buried the memory the way I had learned to bury so many things. Then came the accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit my car on a Tuesday evening. I woke up in the hospital, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped inside a body that wouldn't respond. The doctors called it temporary spinal trauma. They said I would recover in 5 to 7 days. They said I was lucky. They didn't know what my family was saying in the waiting room. I learned later, much later, that when my mother received the call about my accident, her first words to Melissa weren't about concern or worry or love. They were, "This is it. She can't object to anything. Get the documents ready. We need her signature before she recovers." My father was standing right there. He heard every word. He said nothing. That night, Melissa visited my hospital room alone. The lights were dim. The machines beeped steadily. I couldn't turn my head, couldn't close my eyes, couldn't do anything but watch as she leaned close to my ear. "You know what's funny, sister?" she whispered. "We've been waiting for something like this. And here you are, finally useful to us." I lay there in the darkness long after Melissa left, her words echoing in my mind. Finally useful to us. I had spent my entire life being useful to my family, cooking, cleaning, accommodating, disappearing, and none of it had ever been enough. But this, being trapped in a hospital bed, unable to move or speak, this was apparently the version of me they had been waiting for. The next morning, my mother arrived. She didn't look at me when she walked in. She was too busy talking on her phone, pacing by the window as if I were furniture. I couldn't turn my head to watch her, but I could hear every word. "Yes, I have her old signature from the birthday card she sent last year," she said. "The notary says it's good enough. Just make sure the date shows she signed before the accident." There was a pause. Then, 5 days. We just need 5 more days, and it's done. She hung up and finally glanced at me. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or hesitation. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked out without a word. That was when I understood. They weren't just ignoring me. They weren't just taking advantage of my condition. They were forging my signature. They were stealing my inheritance. Grandmother's house, the property she had left equally to Melissa and me, and they were doing it while I lay paralyzed, unable to stop them. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I had ever felt. For 35 years, I had swallowed my anger. I had told myself that keeping the peace was more important than being heard. But there in that hospital bed, I made a decision. I would not lie here and let them destroy me. I would fight back. I just had to figure out how. That afternoon, I noticed her for the first time, Rachel Morrison. She was one of the day shift nurses, tall with short, gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. She was 45, maybe older, with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of experience. When she checked my vitals, she didn't rush. She looked at me, really looked at me. And when Melissa walked in for her afternoon visit, Rachel didn't leave immediately. She lingered by the door, adjusting something on the IV stand, watching. I couldn't speak. I couldn't wave my arms or write a note or do any of the things a normal person would do to ask for help. But I could do one thing: I could feel. And when I felt fear, my heart rate spiked. The machines recorded everything. So when Melissa sat down beside me and started talking about how peaceful I looked, I focused on my terror. I let it rise. I let the monitor scream. Rachel noticed. She came back in, checked the readings, looked at Melissa, looked at me. She didn't say anything. But I saw her write something in her notes. Over the next 2 days, I built my case one heartbeat at a time. Every time Melissa entered my room, I spiked. Every time she left, I calmed. When Rachel was nearby, I blinked 2 quick blinks for yes, 1 long blink for no. It took her a while to understand what I was doing, but she was smart. She started asking questions that could be answered with blinks. Are you afraid of your sister? 2 blinks. Is something happening when she visits? 2 blinks. Do you want me to help you? 2 blinks as fast as I could manage. Rachel started investigating. She pulled the visitor logs. She cross-referenced them with the oxygen monitor irregularities that the night staff had been noting but not questioning. She started paying attention to my mother's phone calls in the hallway. One afternoon, she heard my mother say, "How much longer until the notary finishes?" "We're running out of time." That evening, Rachel came to my bedside when no one else was around. She leaned close and spoke quietly. "I believe you," she said. "Something is very wrong here, but my word against your family won't be enough. We need evidence." She paused. "This state has one-party consent for recordings. That means if you're aware of a recording and you consent to it, anything we capture is legally admissible. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I blinked twice. "Yes." "Do you want me to place a recording device in this room?" 2 blinks. "Yes." "Okay," she said. "We're going to get them, I promise." For the first time since the accident, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. But Melissa wasn't finished with me. She came at 2 in the morning. I heard her footsteps before I saw her quick, agitated, nothing like her usual controlled pace. She had been arguing with someone I would learn later. The notary was getting nervous. There were delays. The timeline was slipping. She stood over my bed, and even in the dim light, I could see the frustration on her face. "You know what the problem is, Jung," she said. "You're recovering too fast. The doctors are talking about you maybe being able to speak by the end of the week, and if you can speak, you can ask questions. You can object. You can ruin everything." She reached for the oxygen tube. "So let's slow things down a little. The documents need 5 more days to clear. We can't have you waking up and asking questions before then." She disconnected the tube, not in anger, not in a rush, calmly, methodically, like she was adjusting a piece of equipment. My lungs screamed for air, the monitors shrieked, and Melissa just stood there watching me struggle, counting the seconds. Then the door burst open. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face frozen in shock. For one terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Melissa yanked the tube back into place and stepped away from the bed. "I was checking if the tube was loose," she said. "It looked like it was coming disconnected. I was trying to help." Rachel didn't respond. She walked to the bed, checked the connections, checked my vitals, and then looked at Melissa with an expression I couldn't read. "I'm going to have to report this," she said. "Hospital protocol." "Report what?" Melissa's voice was sharp. "I didn't do anything wrong. Ask anyone. I've been here every day taking care of my sister. I'm the only one who actually cares about her." Rachel called security. Melissa was escorted out, still protesting, still insisting she had done nothing. And later that night, when the hospital was quiet and no one was watching, Rachel placed a small recording device behind the monitor near my bed. "Next time," she whispered to me, "we'll have proof." But Rachel didn't stop there. She kept digging. She searched public records. She made phone calls. And 3 days later, she found something that made her go pale. It was a police report from 18 years ago filed by a woman named Margaret, my mother's sister. The report described a teenage girl pushing her older sister down a flight of stairs. The victim had been hospitalized for 3 weeks. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. And the aunt who filed the report had been cut off from the family, entirely never heard from again. The teenage girl in that report was Melissa. The victim was me. The teenage girl in that report was Melissa. The victim was me. When Rachel told me what she had found, I felt something shift inside my chest. For 18 years, I had convinced myself that the fall was an accident. I had buried the memory of hands on my back because believing it meant believing something too terrible to accept. But now I knew. Melissa had tried to kill me before, and she was trying again. By the 6th day in the hospital, my body was finally starting to respond. I could move my fingers. I could turn my head slightly. And most importantly, I could whisper. The doctors were encouraged. They said I was recovering faster than expected. They didn't know that my recovery was the one thing standing between my family and everything they wanted to steal from me. Rachel came to see me that morning before her shift officially started. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept. "I found her," she said quietly. "Your Aunt Margaret. She's been living in Arizona for the past 15 years. When I told her what was happening to you, she started crying." Rachel paused. "She said she's been waiting 18 years for someone to believe her. She kept everything Danielle. The police report, her written statement, photographs of your injuries after the fall. It's all in a safe deposit box. She never threw any of it away because she always believed the truth would come out eventually." I felt tears sliding down my cheeks. Aunt Margaret, I barely remembered her. She had disappeared from our lives when I was 17, right after my accident. My mother had told me she was unstable, jealous, that she had made up terrible lies about our family and had to be cut off for everyone's safety. I had believed her. I had believed all of it. "There's more," Rachel said. "I've been documenting everything. Your mother's phone calls about the notary and the signature. The visitor logs showing when your sister comes and goes. The oxygen monitor records that show interference during her visits." She leaned closer. "But we need something definitive. Something that proves this isn't just about the money. We need to show there's a pattern." I knew what she meant. We needed Melissa to confess about the stairs. "I have an idea," I whispered. My voice was barely audible, rough from days of silence. "Let her visit. Don't stop her. I'll get her to talk." Rachel looked uncertain. "Are you sure?" "After what she did last time." "The recorder is running," I said. "And this time I won't be helpless. I'll be ready." Melissa came that afternoon. She walked in like she owned the room, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't tried to suffocate me just 3 days earlier. She sat down in the chair beside my bed and smiled at me with that perfect practiced smile that I had seen my entire life. "The doctors say you're improving," she said. "That's wonderful news. Mom and Dad will be so relieved." I let her talk. I let her fill the silence with her performance of sisterly concern. And then when she paused to check her phone, I spoke. "I've been dreaming," I whispered. She looked up, startled. It was the first time she had heard my voice since before the accident. "About the stairs," I continued. "When I was 17. The color drained from her face. Just for a moment. just enough for me to know I had hit the target. "What about them?" she asked carefully. "I remember hands," I said, "on my back, right before I fell." The silence stretched between us. I watched her process what I had said. I watched her calculate her options, and then I watched her make the worst decision of her life. "You remember." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "After all these years, you finally remember." She stood up and walked to the window, her back to me. "Fine. Yes, I pushed you. I was 15 years old, and I was so tired of everyone asking about poor Danielle in the hospital. Poor Danielle who fell and hurt herself. Poor Danielle who needed 3 weeks to recover. For once in my life, I wanted them to forget you existed." She turned to face me, and her expression was something I had never seen before. Raw, bitter, completely unmasked. "But you didn't die," she said. "You never die. That's your only talent, Danielle. Surviving when you should have disappeared. Mom and Dad spent weeks taking care of you after that fall, and I had to watch. I had to smile and pretend I was worried while they fussed over you like you were the special one." She shook her head. "Do you have any idea what that felt like, being invisible in my own family because you wouldn't stay out of the way?" I said nothing. I didn't need to. The recorder was capturing every word. "It doesn't matter now," she said, composing herself. "That was 18 years ago. No one will believe you. No one ever believes you." She picked up her purse. "Get some rest, sister. You look tired." She walked out without looking back. The moment the door closed, Rachel slipped in through the side entrance. Her eyes were wide. "I heard everything," she said. "The recorder got all of it." "It's not enough," I whispered. "She didn't say anything about the property, about the forgery." "She didn't have to." Rachel pulled out her phone and showed me photographs, visitor logs with dates and times. Screenshots of text messages she had glimpsed on my mother's phone when she left it unattended in the hallway. Notes about notary appointments and signature samples and deadlines. "I've been building the case from the outside while you worked from the inside, and your Aunt Margaret is flying in tomorrow with everything she saved. The police report, the photographs, her written statement about what she saw that day on the stairs." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. For 35 years I had been trained to be silent, to accommodate, to disappear. But lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, while my family plotted against me, I had finally learned something different. I had learned to fight. "Call the police," I said. "Not hospital security, real police. Tell them this isn't just assault, it's attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud through forgery. Tell them they need to seize my mother's phone, the notary's records, and every document related to the property transfer before they can destroy the evidence." Rachel nodded. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "Once we make that call, there's no going back. Your family." "My family tried to kill me," I said. "Twice. They're trying to steal my inheritance while I'm lying here unable to defend myself. There's nothing to go back to." She made the call. The police arrived within the hour. 2 detectives and a uniformed officer. They took my statement. They took Rachel's documentation. They listened to the recording of Melissa's confession. And then they did something I never thought I would see. They treated my words as truth. They believed me. They seized my mother's phone that evening. They got a warrant for the notary's office. They collected every document related to the property transfer and began tracing the conspiracy back through months of planning. What they found on my mother's phone would change everything. Text messages going back 2 years. Conversations with Melissa about my inheritance, about waiting for the right opportunity, about finding a notary willing to forge signatures. Discussions about what would happen if I recovered too quickly, if I asked too many questions, if I got in the way. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a plan that had been building for nearly 2 decades, ever since a 15-year-old girl pushed her sister down the stairs and learned that she could get away with it. And Melissa's confession was just the beginning. And Melissa's confession was just the beginning. The investigation that followed uncovered layer after layer of deception, each one worse than the last. By the time the trial began 3 months later, I had fully recovered from my injuries. I could walk. I could speak. And for the first time in my life, I could tell my story to people who were actually listening. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Local news had picked up the story of family conspiracy involving attempted murder forgery and an 18-year cover-up. People wanted to see the perfect Carter family exposed. They wanted to watch the masks come off. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, and I watched as everything my mother had built came crashing down around her. The prosecutor started with the text messages. They had recovered over 2 years of communications from my mother's phone, and each message painted a clearer picture of who she really was. The first one was sent to Melissa 18 months before my accident. "Don't worry about the money, sweetheart. We'll get Danielle's share when the time is right. She doesn't need it anyway." The second was sent to the notary 3 months before the accident. "I need the signature to look authentic. She sent me a birthday card last year. Use that as a reference. Make sure it's perfect." And the third was sent to Melissa on the day of my accident, just hours after I was admitted to the hospital. "This is our chance. She can't fight back. Start the paperwork immediately." My mother's lawyer tried to argue that the messages were taken out of context. He suggested that my mother was simply trying to help with estate planning, that the word signature referred to something innocent, that there was no proof of criminal intent. But the pattern was undeniable. Message after message showed my mother coordinating with Melissa and the notary to forge documents, transfer property, and steal my inheritance while I lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. When the prosecutor pressed her on the stand, my mother finally broke. "Everything I did was for Melissa," she cried. "You don't understand. Danielle never needed anything. She was always so self-sufficient, so independent. She built her own life without any help from anyone. But Melissa needed me. She needed support. She needed protection. I was just trying to take care of my daughter." I watched her performance from my seat, the tears, the trembling voice, the wounded mother act that had worked on everyone for my entire life. But this time, no one was buying it. The jury sat stone-faced. The judge looked unmoved, and I felt nothing but cold clarity as I watched the woman who raised me try to justify stealing from me and leaving me to die. Then Aunt Margaret took the stand. I hadn't seen her in 18 years. She was older now with silver hair and lines around her eyes, but I recognized her immediately. She was the aunt who used to bring me books when I was sick. The aunt who always remembered my birthday when everyone else forgot. The aunt who vanished from my life without explanation when I was 17 years old. Now I knew why. Margaret's voice was steady as she described what she had witnessed 18 years ago. She had been visiting for Thanksgiving when she saw 15-year-old Melissa standing at the top of the stairs behind me. She saw Melissa place both hands on my back. She saw her push, and she saw me fall tumbling down the entire flight landing at the bottom with injuries that would keep me hospitalized for 3 weeks. "I went to my sister immediately," Margaret testified. "I told Patricia exactly what I saw. I expected her to be horrified. I expected her to get Melissa help. Instead, she looked at me and said, 'If you ever speak of this again, you're dead to this family.' The next day, she told everyone I had made up lies about Melissa because I was jealous. She turned the entire family against me. I lost my sister, my nieces, everyone. All because I told the truth." The prosecutor asked why she had kept the evidence for so long. Margaret's answer silenced the entire courtroom. "I kept the police report, my written statement, photographs of Danielle's injuries, everything in a safe deposit box. I knew someday the truth would come out. I just didn't think it would take 18 years. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "But I never threw anything away. It felt like throwing away Danielle's only chance at justice, and I couldn't do that to her. Even if she never knew I was fighting for her, I couldn't give up." I was crying by the time she finished. 18 years. She had waited 18 years, holding on to evidence, hoping someone would finally believe her, and no one had, until now. The defense tried to salvage what they could. Melissa's lawyer painted her as a victim of her childhood illness, of parental pressure, of psychological damage beyond her control. He argued that she needed treatment, not prison. He suggested that her actions in the hospital were the result of a mental breakdown, not premeditated malice. The prosecution destroyed that argument in minutes. The defense would have you believe that Melissa Carter acted out of desperation and mental instability, the prosecutor said. But let's look at the source of that desperation. He pulled up bank records on the courtroom display. 2 years ago, Melissa Carter borrowed $80,000, not for medical treatment, not for education, not for any legitimate purpose. She borrowed that money for a married man who promised to leave his wife for her. When he took the money and disappeared, she was left with crushing debt and no way to pay it. That's when she started asking her mother about her sister's inheritance. That's when the planning began. Melissa's composure shattered completely. "You don't understand," she screamed from the defendant's table. "I had nothing that was really mine. Danielle had everything: her career, her independence, her identity. She didn't need anyone. I only had them. Mom and Dad were all I had. And I was losing even that because I couldn't keep up the act anymore. I couldn't keep being perfect when I was falling apart inside." The courtroom went silent. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the feeling of my lungs burning as she calmly disconnected my oxygen. I remembered her smile as she watched me struggle for air, and the sympathy vanished. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Melissa was found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric evaluation. She didn't look at me when the sentence was read. She just stared straight ahead, her face completely blank, as if she had already left her body behind. My mother was found guilty of forgery, notary fraud, conspiracy, to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering for threatening Rachel during the investigation. 7 years in prison. When the judge read the sentence, she started sobbing, but I noticed she never once said she was sorry. Not to me, not to Margaret, not to anyone. My father received 3 years suspended sentence, a $75,000 fine, and community service for his role as an accessory after the fact. He had known about everything: the forgery, the attacks, the cover-up, and he had chosen to say nothing. His silence made him complicit. The judge made that clear. The notary lost his license and received 2 years in prison for fraud. He had known exactly what he was doing when he agreed to forge my signature, and he had done it anyway for money. The property transfer was voided. Grandmother's house was returned to me in full. Everything my family had tried to steal was given back. As the bailiffs led my mother out of the courtroom, she turned to look at me one last time. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were hard. "I did everything for this family," she said. "Everything I did was to keep us together." I held her gaze without flinching. "No," I said. "You did everything for yourself, and you used all of us to do it." She opened her mouth to respond, but the bailiffs pulled her through the door before she could speak. The last thing I saw was her face disappearing behind the closing door. And then she was gone. And then she was gone. My mother. My sister, the entire life I had known for 35 years, all of it disappeared behind that courtroom door. I sat there for a long time after everyone else had left, staring at the empty seats where my family had been. I thought I would feel something more dramatic. Relief, maybe. Or grief. Instead, I just felt tired. The kind of deep exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that you forgot you were carrying it at all. The months that followed the trial were strange. I had won, but I didn't know what winning was supposed to look like. For my entire life, I had defined myself in relation to my family, the invisible sister, the caretaker, the one who accommodated and disappeared. Without them, I had to figure out who I actually was. I started by letting go of everything that connected me to my old life. I sold my apartment in the city where I had grown up. I sold grandmother's house, the property my family had tried to steal the inheritance that had almost cost me my life. I didn't want it anymore. Every room held memories I needed to forget. Every corner reminded me of the people who had betrayed me. The money from the sales gave me enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere I had chosen for myself, rather than defaulting to because it was close to family. I moved to Portland, Oregon. I had never been there before. I knew no one. And that was exactly why I chose it. For the first time in my life, I could build something that belonged only to me. I found a small apartment with a balcony that faced east so I could watch the sunrise every morning. I filled the balcony with plants, tomatoes, herbs, flowers I didn't know the names of, and I learned to take care of growing things. I got a job at a nonprofit organization that helps survivors of family fraud rebuild their financial lives. It felt right using what I had been through to help others who were going through the same thing. Every client I worked with reminded me that I wasn't alone, that families destroy their own more often than anyone wants to admit, and that survival is its own kind of victory. I started writing in a journal every night. Just a few pages, nothing fancy, but it was something I had never allowed myself before. Growing up, I learned that my thoughts didn't matter, that my feelings were inconvenient, that the safest thing to do was keep everything inside where no one could use it against me. But now there was no one to judge me, no one to dismiss me, no one to call me dramatic for having emotions. I could write whatever I wanted, and the only person who would ever read it was me. Slowly, I began to discover who I was without the weight of being the invisible sister. I liked cooking. I liked long walks in the rain. I liked reading novels late at night and sleeping in on weekends. I liked the sound of my own voice when I wasn't constantly monitoring it for tone volume and whether it might upset someone. These were small things, ordinary things, but they felt revolutionary. I was learning to exist without apologizing for it. 6 months after the trial, I flew to Arizona to visit Aunt Margaret. She picked me up at the airport herself, and when I saw her waiting at the arrivals gate, I started crying before I could stop myself. This woman had lost 18 years of family because she told the truth about what happened to me. She had been called a liar, cast out, erased from our lives, and she had never stopped believing that someday justice would come. She had kept evidence in a safe deposit box for nearly 2 decades, waiting for someone to finally listen. We drove to her house in the desert, a small adobe place surrounded by cactus and silence. That evening, we sat on her porch looking at old photographs, pictures of me as a child that I had never seen before, pictures of Margaret holding me when I was a baby, standing next to my mother, before everything fell apart, pictures of a family that might have been if things had been different. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you then," Margaret said quietly. "I should have fought harder. I should have gone to the police myself instead of just filing a report. I should have found a way to stay in your life." I shook my head. "You did fight," I told her. "You kept the evidence for 18 years. You never gave up on the truth, even when everyone told you to let it go. Even when they made you the villain for trying to save me." I took her hand. "That's why I'm free now. Because you refused to let them erase what happened. You held on to my story when I couldn't hold it myself." She squeezed my hand and didn't let go for a long time. I stayed with Margaret for a week. We cooked together, took walks in the desert, talked about everything and nothing. She told me stories about my grandmother, about what our family was like before my mother took control of the narrative. She showed me that blood doesn't have to mean betrayal. That family can be the people who choose to believe you, who fight for you, who refuse to abandon you, even when it costs them everything. When I left Arizona, I knew I would be back. Margaret was my family now, my real family. Not because we shared DNA, but because she had proven her love through 18 years of quiet loyalty. That meant more than anything my parents had ever given me. A few weeks after I returned to Portland, I received a letter from my father. His handwriting was shaky, older looking than I remembered. The letter was short. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I should have spoken up. I was a coward. I knew what your mother and Melissa were doing, and I said nothing because it was easier. Because I told myself it wasn't my business. Because I didn't want to deal with the conflict. I failed you, Danielle. I know that now. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat with it for several days thinking about what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him. He was my father, after all. He had never actively tried to hurt me. He had just stood by and watched while others did. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Standing by is a choice. Silence is a choice. And his silence had nearly cost me my life. I wrote back eventually. My letter was even shorter than his. "I believe you're sorry," I wrote. "But sorry doesn't undo 20 years of silence. You watched them plan to steal from me. You watched Melissa try to kill me. And you said nothing. You chose peace over my safety. You chose comfort over my life. I don't hate you. Hatred takes too much energy, and I've wasted enough of my life on this family. I just don't need you anymore. Please don't contact me again." I sealed the envelope without tears. This wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I was done carrying people who had refused to carry me. 8 months after the trial, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over Portland. The city was waking up below me, cars beginning to move, lights flickering on in apartment windows, the world starting another ordinary day. I touched the scar on my back, the one I had carried for 18 years, the one from the stairs. I used to hide it, ashamed of a wound I couldn't explain, a story I couldn't tell. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't a mark of weakness. It was proof that I survived. Proof that I was always stronger than they wanted me to be. Proof that no matter how many times they tried to erase me, I was still here. My phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Portland next month for a conference. Dinner. I smiled and typed back, I'll cook. I set the phone down and looked out at the city, at the mountains in the distance, at the life I had built from the wreckage of the one I had lost. This was what freedom felt like. Not revenge, not victory, just peace. Just finally being allowed to exist without apologizing for it. They say family is everything, but sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who bleed you dry. Real family. That's the people who choose to believe you when everyone else turns away. And sometimes the only way to find yourself is to walk away from everyone who told you who to be. And that's where Danielle's story ends, not with revenge, not with hatred, but with something far more powerful, freedom. The freedom to wake up every morning without fear. The freedom to build a life on her own terms. The freedom to finally stop apologizing for existing. But this story speaks to something many of us have experienced. How many of us have been the invisible one in our families? How many of us have been told we're being dramatic when we tried to speak the truth? How many of us have watched someone else get protected while we were expected to shrink and disappear? If this story resonated with you, I want you to know you're not crazy. You're not dramatic. If your family made you feel invisible, that says everything about them and nothing about your worth. And if you've ever had to walk away from people who should have loved you in order to save yourself, that's not weakness. That's courage. I would love to hear your thoughts. Did Danielle make the right choice by cutting off her father? Do you think Melissa was born that way, or did her parents create the monster? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth? Share your story in the comments below. If you felt something during this story, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for listening. Protect your peace, and remember, sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you were born into. Until next time.